Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, which is generously underwritten by Sage, we're going to be talking about the power of documentaries as learning tools. And in that discussion, we'll cover the full range of documentary instruction, from creation to classroom. We'll talk about instructional techniques, learning outcomes, distribution models, and, of course, effective librarian and faculty collaborations. We're lucky to be joined by a fully cross-functional group of guests, including a librarian, filmmakers and producers, faculty, and a publisher-distributor. Joining me are César Hernandez, a documentary filmmaker who most recently directed and produced the film Unseen. Virginia Espino, a film producer and continuing lecturer at the César E. Chávez Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA. Sarah Feinbloom, a filmmaker and the founder of the documentary film production and distribution company Good Docs. Gisèle Tanasse, film and media services librarian at UC Berkeley, and Michael Carmichael, senior director, library editorial at Sage, which acquired Good Docs toward the end of 2024. In this first episode, we examine documentaries as learning tools from the perspectives of a filmmaker and producer. Okay, so welcome to the program, everyone. Virginia, I think we'll start with you. I'm wondering, can you just provide an overview, if you can, of how documentaries can complement curricula? I mean, how are you using documentary films in your courses at UCLA, for example?
Great. Thank you for that question. So, documentary films allow students to explore themes in a different way. They get to engage in topics and themes in a different way than they would reading peer-reviewed literature. So, while peer-reviewed literature is really important for learning in an academic setting, documentary films allow the students to enter into a topic from a different perspective. So, documentary films really augment the scholarship that we expect students to be engaged with in our classes.
Mm-hmm.
Documentary films provide firsthand experiences that might not be articulated in a piece of scholarship. They provide eyewitness accounts. They provide meaning. So in my class, any of my classes, I use the film that I co-produced, No Más Bebés, that looks at the forced sterilization of Mexican women at the LA County Hospital. And there's a wonderful book that looks at that same case. It's written by Elena Gutierrez. So we use Elena Gutierrez Fertile Matters, the politics of Mexican origin women's reproduction, to complement the themes in No Más Bebés, but also No Más Bebés complements what is documented in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So the scholarship gives us context, it gives us historical relevance, it gives us paradigms, and the documentary film really gives us meaning, feeling, emotion. It really humanizes the experiences of the sterilization survivors in a way that is very compelling for the students and very engaging.
Yeah, that's excellent. I was going to ask you, if you typically see scholarship being paired up with, sort of a matching documentary, because that seems like a really powerful combination in the learning context.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
that's really the only way I use documentary film in my classes is when I have some sort of scholarship to help the students unpack the themes
Mm-hmm.
through the documentary film genre. For example, I'm currently teaching a class on care work, on domestic work, and we just watched the documentary film Made in America, and that complements a lot of the wonderful scholarship that has been put out in the last decade. Mary Romero, for example,
Mm-hmm.
writes a lot about domestic workers.
Okay, excellent. And then Sarah, over to you. I mean, anything you can add on how the characteristics of documentary films aid in teaching and learning?
Yeah, sure. I really agree with what Virginia's saying around the kind of the feeling and the meaning that they can convey. When you're watching a documentary, you're also hearing the music and you're hearing people's voices and you're seeing their facial expressions, and that immediacy, that kind of really being present with people as they're going through things, is very, very powerful in a classroom. And you're learning on sort of with different senses and different levels of like consciousness, right? Because
Hmm.
you might not even be noticing that the music is swelling or dropping out, but it is evoking kind of that a larger experience of knowledge, I think. And the other thing I would just add to that is it's very hard for uh, us to be everywhere and for us to be, you know, walking in other people's shoes, basically. And documentaries allow you as the viewer to do that, to be somewhere else, to be with a worker in a hotel, or a politician, or a young person struggling with suicide, or something that maybe you so kind of witnessing people and developing empathy through being with them while they're experiencing something, I think, is part of learning. It's not just scholarship, it's emotional intelligence, it's awareness of all the other people that we and plants and animals, anything that's featured in all of these amazing documentaries that are coexisting with us. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, fabulous. I think can maybe Virginia and Sarah, or have you seen or can you talk about how sort of that emotional connection, and sort of that extrasensory kind of connection students are able to have through documentaries, how that then kind of translates into their ability to sort of into learning outputs, like does it help in this sort of research process, or is it, just a nice thing to have in the mix when they're learning about a particular topic?
Okay, I'll take that and I'll talk about it in terms of No Mas Bebés,
Okay.
because it's a very special film in relation to the Mexican American experience. There aren't a lot of films or documentaries that explore Mexican American culture. And even though it's a tragic story, what we tried to do was really convey the sterilization survivors and all their complexity
Hmm.
as whole people, as people who love, as people who cry, as people who have families, as people who have suffered, but also as people who have fought against injustice. So a lot of my students who come from those same communities will say things like, wow, that could have been my tia, or that could have
Mm.
been my mom. Oh, I've never seen anybody who looks like me on the big screen like that. So while that's not a learning outcome per se,
Right.
I feel like it teaches the student that their stories matter, that their history matters, and that provides some sort of sense of power and of affirmation and
Mm.
validation. In terms of learning outcomes, what we also try to do with the film is to create a counter narrative to what has already been documented about this case and about Mexican Americans overall, because our culture, my culture, has been pathologized in terms of our reproductive lives. So this film just really creates a counter narrative and
Hmm.
allows Mexican American mothers to speak for themselves.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you. Set. Can you talk about your film Unseen? What does that documentary focus on? And then how do you see it building, as we were just kind of talking, how do you see it building skills and critical thinking and fostering social awareness?
For sure. Thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation, and so grateful for Good Docs and Sage for the work that they do. I should also say that No Mas Bibis was actually a film that I watched while we were developing Unseen, because the director, Rene Tajima Peña, was one of my mentors. So it's just like an honor to be here. Thank you so much. Having said that, maybe I'll start off with an anecdote. In high school, my Spanish teacher showed us this documentary called De Nadie about Central American migrants who were looking for better lives elsewhere, and their migration journey to the United States. And just feeling so moved by that film. Little did I know, it wasn't until I was graduating from high school, years after I first saw that movie, that I learned that I was, and still am, an undocumented immigrant. So in college, I was part of student organizing. And one of the first times that I actually saw my own immigrant journey reflected in any kind of media was watching a short documentary called Lost and Found by the late filmmaker Tam Tran. I'm naming all of this because in my own personal life also, when I was younger, I have experienced what it's like to find solace and community by watching the stories of other people who I thought have had no relationship to my own story. Turns out our humanity is much more shared than I realized, feeling less alone and feeling this sense of community in that way, to what just Virginia was talking about. So I think, especially, considering that the films that are in discussion right now get shared in college settings. Many people in college are like young adults or older teens, depending on how you look at it. It's like a time where people are trying to get a sense of their identities and who they are, their place in the world. And in so many ways, I feel that stories of everyday people, the trials and triumphs that they go through, this is like the perfect time to do that. Having said that, the film that I have with Good Docs and Sage is called Unseen. It follows the story of my friend who is an aspiring social worker, and he happens to be living at the intersection of being a blind person who is also an undocumented immigrant. And when we started making the film, we really wanted to make sure that the film is prioritizing audiences that are often overlooked, namely undocumented audiences and also blind and disabled people. How often do we get to say that filmmakers are making a film for blind people? And with our film, so much of the aesthetics that surround the film, the use of out of focus cinematography, the centering of audio as the vehicle for the narrative of the film, are really our effort to imagine what equitable enjoyment of cinema looks like, where a person that is sighted or not blind gets to enjoy more than the person that the film is about, who also happens to be blind. So I think interestingly, having said all of this, also having such a specific audience in mind, focusing on the very specific story of a person, the Center for Media and Social Impact actually has a study that will come out in late spring 2025, where they looked at the experience of audiences who have watched our film. They did a survey of 350 plus audience members across the country about what their experience was like watching Unseen. And interestingly, even though the story, this is not actually unexpected, because I think it was Martin Scorsese who said what's personal is most artistic. Um, what we learned in the study is that even though the story of Unseen is so specific to a certain person's experience about being a social worker who is blind and undocumented, like I think 95% of the audiences felt so much connection to the film in one way or another, or a majority of the audiences felt connection to the story regardless of their identities, their immigration status, or disability. And unexpectedly, also, even though LGBTQ identity doesn't show up in the film a lot, it shows up there, but in like very, like small sprinklings. But even though that's the case, LGBTQ young people, especially, found a lot of resonance with the narrative of the film also. So I'm saying all of this because I think it's not so much just about the way that films educate through the lens of intellect and logos, for lack of better words, but how can films connect the things that we learn in class stories to what Sarah was saying, how stories serve as a bridge between the things that we learn and that we know to be true and the application into the real world, whether it's our spiritual well-being, whether it's the way we relate to other people, and leveraging the stories that we experience other people to find that sense of connection and building bridges with others that allow us to foster communities and recognizing that we are not just people living into ourselves, but we are part of a larger whole.
Mm. Excellent. Thank you for saying that, Seth. That was great. And I'm wondering, just out of curiosity, when you're making a film, are you conscious of that educational component? Is that sort of part of your thinking process as you're creating the film? Are you seeing a direct line from the film into an educational context specifically, or not so much?
For sure. Thank you for that question. I think, in reflection of that, while I do make films with certain audiences in mind, at the end of the day, I really only pursue projects, especially independent documentary filmmaking, that takes years to do. Like for Unseen, it took us 7 years to make it.
Mhm.
I feel like it's only worth doing something like that if I'm really invested in it and if I'm really interested in it.
Mhm.
All that to say, at the end of the day, I don't know if anyone here has said this before actually, but at the end of the day, I think in many ways, filmmakers, we ourselves are our own audiences also. And I'm saying this in relation to the question posed because I am I am interested in becoming a better version of myself than who I was 5 minutes ago, who I was a day ago, and if we're thinking about education beyond just the classroom, beyond just the intellectual side of things,
Mm.
and really improving our sense of self, the way we relate to the larger world around us, then yes, I think in just as much as I am interested in the process or of learning something about the world and myself through the film, I hope that the same experiences that I experienced in making of the film, in watching the final cut the first time myself, and actually with Unseen also, what I've learned in the course of making the film is that it wasn't just me. Our entire team actually got something out of the film, whether it's learning about a whole other set of circumstances of life or just learning about ourselves through the spiritual element of the film. If we got something out of the process of making the film, the excitement then of sharing the film out into the world is that, wow, what would it be like if we get to share the same feeling that we had with other people who watch the film? And maybe just like something that I'll note is one of the most rewarding moments that we had in sharing Unseen, is that an audience member who is neither an immigrant nor a person with disability comes up to me and she says, I came here to watch a film to learn about somebody else's life. Instead, I'm learning more about myself. And I
Yeah.
think that's really that kind of learning and education is what I'm really interested in, because the book, the text, the professor is there to share the knowledge. How can the stories then, like Sarah and Virginia have already named, can make the connection to our self and the larger world?
Fantastic. Thank you, Seth. You just heard from Set Hernandez, a documentary filmmaker who most recently directed and produced the film Unseen, Virginia Espino, a film producer and continuing lecturer at the César E. Chávez Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA, Sarah Feinbloom, a filmmaker and the founder of the documentary film production and distribution company Good Docs, Gisèle Tanasse, film and media services librarian at UC Berkeley, and Michael Carmichael, Senior Director, Library Editorial at Sage. Join us next week when we go beyond the bookshelf and talk about how documentary collections are specially curated and distributed. This series is underwritten with generous support from Sage. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.